I still remember that morning, standing in the living room, looking at Henry's shirt still hanging on the chair like he just stepped out for a few minutes. For 8 years, Henry left the house every Friday at exactly 9 a.m., always wearing the same coat. And for those 8 years, he never explained. No long stories, not a word. Just one line: "I've got something to take care of." I didn't ask. I used to think that in a marriage, some private corners were better left untouched. But later I learned this. Some silences aren't meant to protect yourself, but to hide something else. Henry passed on a May afternoon, as gently as he lived. No warning, no final message. And just a few days later, I was standing in the bank he'd gone to every week for almost a decade. I only wanted to finish the paperwork he left behind. I thought I was calm enough to face everything. But then the teller looked up, recognized me, and asked, "Are you here today to transfer money to that little girl again?" I froze. One question, and it tore open 8 years of silence. What girl? Why was Henry sending money to a child I'd never even heard of? And why did they think I knew about it? A chill ran down my back. I don't remember how I walked away from the counter. I only remember the sound of the bank's glass door closing behind me, heavy like an unseen accusation. To understand how everything led to that moment, I have to go back to the final months before Henry passed, a time that looked steady on the surface but underneath had cracks forming for a long while. Back then, our marriage wasn't bad. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet outsiders would call stable, but the people living in it know how cold and distant it really is. We didn't fight, but we didn't reach for each other the way we used to. Sometimes a relationship doesn't break with shouting. It breaks with long stretches of silence, where both people slowly step back. I'm an art teacher. I've spent my life working with color, yet back then my marriage felt like a painting drained down to 2 shades of gray. I notice things. I see small changes, tiny distances. Henry thought he was hiding. A glance he turned away. A question he didn't answer. An evening he stayed in his office longer than usual. But what haunted me most were the Friday mornings. Henry always put more care into his appearance on those days. Not enough to be obvious, but I saw it. He smoothed his hair more carefully, chose a pair of shoes he rarely wore, and left the house with the focus of someone stepping into a world I didn't belong to. I used to wonder if I was just overthinking everything. Then I'd tell myself that Henry had always been a private man. He rarely talked about his past, about old relationships, or about whatever had changed him before we met. He always said, "Some things feel lighter when you talk about them." Back then, I believed him. But now, looking back, that line feels more like a door he shut tight so I couldn't see what was behind it. I'm not the kind of woman who goes digging for secrets. I'm quiet, steady. I never wanted to make a scene or push things to an uncomfortable place. But I wasn't blind. Henry's distance left empty spaces in me. Some nights I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was being abandoned inside a marriage that looked stable from the outside. What I did know for sure was this: Henry was hiding something. Something he carried with him every Friday and brought home as if nothing had happened. And now, after hearing that question from the bank teller, I knew his secret was bigger than a routine. Bigger than the silence I'd been living with for years. That night, I sat alone in the living room, Henry's coat still draped over the chair like it was waiting for him to come back. I stared at it for a long time, then looked down at my hands, shaking, partly from hurt, partly from fear, but mostly because I knew this. I couldn't stay outside this story anymore. I didn't have Henry to ask anymore, but I still had the bank. And I still had the right to know how my husband had been living outside our marriage. Eventually, I stood up, grabbed my purse, and told myself one thing. Tomorrow, I'm going back there. And this time, I'm not leaving without knowing what Henry was really doing. That was the moment I decided. I would open the door Henry had kept locked for 8 years, even if whatever waited behind it could change everything. The next morning, I went back to the bank. Not as a widow handling paperwork, but as someone stepping into a dark room her husband left behind. I wasn't sure what scared me more, finding the truth or finding nothing at all. I carried a small purse with me, holding only Henry's death certificate and our marriage license. The glass doors opened, letting me in with a blast of cold air and bright white light that made me a little dizzy. I stood still for a moment, steadying myself before walking to the counter. The same teller from yesterday recognized me. She looked apologetic, avoiding any mention of the question that had shaken me. I didn't blame her. She only said what she thought was routine. It was that routineness that chilled me the most. I handed over the documents. My husband had an account here. I need to know everything related to it. She checked the screen. Lines of text reflected off her glasses, but I couldn't make any of it out. All I saw was the slight pause in her eyes, just one beat, before she said, "There's an account opened before you and he were married." I tightened my grip on my bag. "I want to see it." She printed out a stack of papers. The very first page threw me off balance for a moment. Account opened 12 years ago, which meant before we even met. I turned to the next page. A long statement list, neat, precise. Every Friday, without missing a single week, Henry deposited a fixed amount of money. For 8 years, no gaps, no changes in the amount. He kept that routine even on weeks when he was sick, even the week we fought and Henry slept on the couch. No ordinary person keeps a habit that consistent if it's just for work. This wasn't a task to handle. This was something far more important, or far more personal. A cold rush went through me. Who's the beneficiary? The teller turned the screen toward me. Just one line, centered on the display, clear as a slap. Sophie Watson, 11 years old. The room felt like it shrank for a moment. 11 years old. I didn't need anyone to explain. My mind connected the dots on its own, in the cruelest way. If she's 11, if Henry had been transferring money for 8 years, if this account was opened before we ever met, then the most reasonable possibility was only one. Henry had a child outside our marriage. I heard my own breathing, heavy and uneven. Broken images started flooding back. The times Henry turned off his phone screen the moment I walked in. How he avoided talking about his past. The statements that showed up in the mail and disappeared before I could read them. The way he grew tense the weeks I said we should reorganize our finances. Everything fell like shards of glass, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I asked, my voice no longer steady, "Is there any other file related to the beneficiary?" The teller handed me a thin folder. I opened it. With every page I felt farther from Henry than I'd ever been. Elementary school tuition, Oakview Elementary. After-school care fees, pediatrician payment records, 6 straight years. Receipts for clothes, shoes, school supplies, all lining up with the exact time frame Henry left the house every Friday. I stared at those numbers and felt something pulling my chest tight. For 8 years, I'd lived beside a husband I thought I knew, but he was actually the person I understood least in the world. I set the papers down on the desk, my hands falling to my sides. The teller spoke softly, "If you need more information, I can help." I shook my head. "No. Thank you, I know enough." But that was the biggest lie I had ever said. I walked out of the bank into the harsh noon sunlight, but it felt like winter around me. I stood by my car for a long moment, my fingers touching the paper with the girl's name on it. Sophie Watson. A child. An 11-year-old child Henry had supported, protected, cared for 8 years, while the wife who slept beside him every night never even knew she existed. The pain didn't hit like a stab. It crept in, slow and cold, like water filling my chest. I pulled out my phone and searched her name. Not much came up, just an old address. A small clue, but enough to open the next path. I got in the car, closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard my own voice, low and certain. I have to meet her. Not to blame her. Not to look for someone at fault. But to understand who Henry was in the part of his life he kept hidden from me. That's when I decided I would find Sophie, and I would uncover the truth waiting for me at the end of that road. It took me nearly an hour to drive to the address I'd found online. It was a neighborhood on the edge of the city, where the walls were faded and the front yards looked like no one had cared for them in years. Old dusty cars lined the street. There was a kind of stillness in the air, like the whole block was trying to live quietly enough to stay unnoticed. I parked in front of house number 27. The front door was slightly open, as if no one had the energy to close it anymore. I walked up the steps and knocked lightly. A tired-looking middle-aged woman opened the door. Her face was worn, her eyes rimmed with shadows. "Who are you looking for?" she asked. Short tone, but not unfriendly. "I'm looking for Sophie. Sophie Watson." She stared at me for a few seconds, then turned her head inside. "Sophie, someone's here for you." The girl stepped out, smaller than I expected. Her hair was pulled back into a quick ponytail, her t-shirt hung too loose, and her hands were smudged with marker ink. But it was her eyes that caught my breath. Cautious but soft, like someone who'd long learned the world wasn't always kind. I opened my wallet and took out the only photo I had with me. A picture of Henry taken last year. I didn't know why I brought it. Maybe I believed it would lead me to what I needed to know. When the photo came into view, Sophie froze. "Uncle Henry," she said right away. Not a question. No hesitation. Like his name was a familiar piece of her life. I looked at her and felt something sharp and soft hit my chest at the same time. "You knew him?" Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen when she stood next to the woman caring for her. "He always brought me markers, and books too. He said he wanted me to keep drawing." She paused. "He was really nice." I had to grip the edge of the small table by the door to keep my balance. Henry, the man who almost never surprised me with a gift, had been quietly visiting a child, teaching her to draw, giving her things I always thought he barely noticed. The woman looked at me carefully. "What were you to him?" I was his wife." Silence fell between us like a heavy curtain. The woman exhaled, avoiding my eyes. "I only look after Sophie a few days a week. Her mother isn't doing well." I understood. No details needed. Sophie tugged gently on my sleeve. "Do you want to come inside?" I nodded. Inside, the house was simple, carrying a damp smell mixed with cigarette smoke, but the small table by the window was strangely tidy, drawing paper, colored markers, a few children's books stacked neatly. I recognized the handwriting on one of the covers. Henry had written a small note. "For Sophie. Don't stop learning." I sat down, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sophie, can you tell me about Uncle Henry? How long have you known him?" She swung her legs, thinking for a moment. "I met him when I was 3. My dad had just died. Mom cried a lot and stopped taking care of me. Uncle Henry came to the house, talked to her, then took me out to eat, took me to the doctor. He said he promised my dad he'd help me grow up safe." I tightened my hands slightly. "Who was your dad, Sophie?" "My dad was Thomas, Uncle Henry's best friend." She said it like it was something everybody should know. "Dad told me he saved Uncle Henry once in an accident. Dad said Uncle Henry was the best person he ever met." A small burst went off in my head, like every assumption I'd carried since leaving the bank had turned to dust. Henry wasn't her father. He hadn't betrayed me. He'd been repaying a debt of loyalty, and he'd done it for 8 years, quietly, without a single explanation. I took a deep breath. "Sophie, where's your mom?" Her eyes dropped, the light they held when she talked about Henry fading instantly. "Mom sleeps a lot. Sometimes all day, sometimes she leaves and I don't know where she goes. Uncle Henry said I should stay with Miss Linda for a while." She glanced toward the woman. "He said, when Mom gets better, she'll come get me." The woman near the door let out a tired sigh. "Gets better. You know what that means." I didn't ask anything else. I looked at Sophie, a child who hadn't been protected the way she deserved, yet had been held up by Henry in a quiet, heartbreaking way. "Do you have anything from Uncle Henry?" I asked. Sophie immediately ran to the small table and pulled out a little box. "I keep everything in here." She opened the lid. Inside were a brand new box of markers, a tiny pair of fleece gloves, a math workbook with a few pages Henry had marked, a birthday card in the handwriting I knew so well, "Wishing you another year of strength." I touched the little gloves. Henry had never given me anything like that. He wasn't the type to be thoughtful with gifts for his wife. Yet with Sophie, he'd noticed every detail. A flash of jealousy moved through me, quick but real. Jealous of the tenderness he gave a child I didn't even know existed. But that feeling was swallowed almost instantly by something heavier. The ache of realizing Henry had been lonely enough to anchor himself to a promise made to a dead friend just to keep going. Sophie handed me another white envelope. "Uncle Henry gave me this last week, but I forgot to put it in the box." I took it. The envelope was thicker than usual, sealed tight. In the corner was Henry's familiar handwriting, rushed but careful. I felt my heart start to pound. Something about the envelope made me hesitate. "Did you open it?" Sophie shook her head. "He said to open it only when something important happened, but I don't know when something is important." I swallowed. "Can I see it?" She nodded. I opened the envelope with slightly shaking fingers. Inside were a few receipts, an appointment card for one of Sophie's checkups, and a second, smaller envelope, pale yellow. On the front, just one line, "Marianne." I froze. Henry left a letter? For me? But why did he give it to Sophie before he died? And why didn't he leave it for me directly? I pressed my lips together, torn between opening it right away and fearing what might spill out from those lines. It could be an explanation, or a confession, or something even worse. Linda, standing near the door, spoke softly, her tone gentler than before. "If you want to stay a bit longer, you can." The girl, she cared about him a lot. I'm sure she'd want to know what he left for you. I looked at the envelope with my name on it, and it felt like Henry was standing right behind me, quiet as always, waiting for me to uncover the truth he never had the courage to say while he was alive. I placed the envelope into Sophie's small hands and gently brushed her hair. "Thank you." But the truth was, I wasn't ready. Not yet. Not here. Not in front of a child who had already lost the two most important men in her life. I stood up, taking the yellow envelope with me, and I knew whatever was inside it would change everything about how I saw Henry and our marriage. I sat in my car for a long time before opening the letter. The streetlight shone through the windshield, casting a pale glow on the yellow envelope lying on my lap. It was too small to hold an entire truth, yet somehow too heavy for me to open without my hands shaking. Finally, I tore the edge. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. Henry's handwriting, familiar, neat, leaning slightly to the left. The handwriting of a man who tried to keep everything in order, even when he himself wasn't. "Marianne, I know you'll hate me for staying silent, but I didn't know how to tell you everything without hurting you. I was never good at that." I stopped reading and took a deep breath. Henry always chose silence, and I always thought it was because he didn't care. Turns out, it wasn't. I know there were times you wanted to leave our marriage. I don't blame you. I saw you sad, saw you pull away. I knew I didn't make you feel loved the way you deserved. But I loved you. I loved you in a clumsy way you couldn't see. I closed my eyes. A small pain bloomed somewhere deeper than my chest. I didn't talk about my past because my past wasn't pretty. I lost my best friend Thomas in a way I never recovered from. I promised him I'd take care of his little girl, and it's the one promise I never dared to break. I could almost picture Henry pressing harder on the words "never dared." I was afraid that if I told you, you'd think I had another family. I was afraid it would hurt you. I was afraid you'd leave. And I was afraid I wasn't good enough for you to stay. I swallowed hard. For 7 years, I'd believed I was the one left behind in the silence. Now I realized Henry had been carrying his own fear all along. The last lines of the letter held me still for several seconds. And one more thing. "I'm sorry, I paid off your school debt without telling you. I just wanted to ease your burden, not make you feel like you owed me anything. I know how proud you are. I didn't want to put you in that position." I set the letter on the seat and pressed my hands to my face. I remembered that time clearly, my job unstable, that tuition debt hanging over me like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Then suddenly, everything was paid off. I thought the school made a mistake. Henry just said, "Guess we got lucky." I believed him. And I moved on, never asking again. Now I understood. He stayed quiet because he didn't want me to feel small. He thought the only way he knew how to love was to stand behind me. I drove home in silence. The house, already spacious, felt even bigger now, stretched by an emptiness no sound could fill. In Henry's office, I opened the drawer he always kept locked. The key was in his wallet, which I'd picked up at the hospital. The drawer clicked open, and I knew right away I'd found what he'd been hiding. There were old envelopes, a few receipts, and some papers he clearly never wanted me to see. Transfer slips to Linda Carson, temporary guardian of Sophie, pharmacy bills for an adult, Sophie's mother, and worst of all, handwritten notes from that woman, sharp and threatening. "If you don't want your wife to know you're raising your illegitimate kid, you'd better." I stopped reading. Not because I couldn't handle the words, but because Henry had faced them alone. He'd paid her, more than once. Not because he was weak, but because he knew that if Child Protective Services stepped in, Sophie would be thrown into the system, and it could ruin her life. Henry chose silence because he chose Sophie, and he chose to protect me from the wrong story. I sat in the chair he used to sit in. The cushion still dipped at the back, like it was holding the shape of Henry's shoulders. I laid the papers on the desk and looked at each line of messy threats, each payment Henry sent just to keep the peace. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I just felt a slow, steady ache. A man carrying a whole world inside him with no idea how to share it. A lost friend. A child abandoned. A promise that turned into a burden. And a wife, me, standing outside everything I should have been allowed to know. I read his letter again. Every line felt like he was looking straight at me. Henry wasn't silent because he didn't care. He was silent because he thought it was the only way to keep what was left intact. But he wasn't here to be threatened anymore. And Sophie was still the one getting hurt. And that woman, Sophie's mother, was still using her child's vulnerability as an excuse to take advantage of it all. I stood up and gathered every piece of paper into a folder. Not to hide it, but to use it. This story couldn't end with silence again. I looked around Henry's office one last time. The things he left behind, his old watch, the black and white photo of us, the stacks of documents arranged with almost obsessive care. This room had been the place where he sat alone with secrets I was never allowed to touch. But the rest of the story, the part I now held in my hands, belonged to me. I stepped out of the room and closed the door so softly it made no sound. Then I said it out loud, for the first time since Henry left my life. Henry, I'm going to do what you never got the chance to do. And that was the moment I decided I would go see that woman, not for blind revenge, but to stop the extortion, protect Sophie, and finish what Henry had started with every bit of kindness he had. I spent 2 days getting everything ready. Not to plan revenge, but to make sure nothing I did would hurt Sophie ever again. I copied every document, arranged the evidence in chronological order, and placed it all into a thick folder. Each page was a piece of the truth Henry had carried alone for years. On Friday morning, I drove to the house where Sophie's mother lived. The window was wide open, the curtains torn and fluttering. The air felt heavy, like the place had grown used to bad things happening. She opened the door after my second knock. Her face was tired, her eyes wary, and for a split second she looked confused, realizing I wasn't some social worker checking in. "I want to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She tried to close the door, but I set my hand against the frame, not forceful, just firm enough to stop her. "I'm Henry's wife." Her expression changed immediately, not out of grief, out of fear. I stepped into the house. The place was cluttered, smelling of cigarettes and stale beer. I pulled out a chair and sat right in the middle of the room, as if this were a meeting and I was the one running it. I opened the folder and laid each document on the old wooden table. The bank statements, Sophie's school tuition bills, pediatric clinic receipts, the envelopes of cash Henry had given her. And most important, the sloppy, threatening notes I found in my husband's office. She faltered. "What are you doing here? I didn't do anything wrong." I looked straight into her eyes, my voice steady, sharp without needing to rise. "You exploited a child, and Henry isn't here anymore to protect her." I slid the stack of papers toward her. "But I am." She trembled slightly. "You don't understand. I needed the money. I understand," I cut in, my tone calm to the point of cold. "But you didn't take the money to care for Sophie. You took it to fuel the very life that's destroying her." She lowered her head, no argument left. I gathered the folder. "Child Protective Services will have copies of all of this by the end of today. They'll investigate, and you'll lose custody. Not because I want to hurt you, but because Sophie deserves protection." Her face went pale. "You can't do that." "I already did," I said as I stood, "and you know it's the right thing." When I walked out the door, the woman stood frozen inside, like the world had just left her behind in a way she never expected. But the truth was, the world had only just started to look directly at her. I sent the entire file to CPS that same afternoon. The investigation moved faster than I expected. She was cited for financial abuse and child neglect. Her temporary custody was revoked almost immediately. Sophie was placed back with her legal temporary guardian, where she would actually be cared for. I went to CPS and filed to become Sophie's secondary guardian. Not to replace her parents, but to make sure she had a reliable adult in her life, someone who truly saw her. When I signed the final form, I realized the feeling in my chest wasn't anger, and it wasn't victory. It felt like a door had just closed. Gently, and in the right way. Henry had held that door shut for too long. Now it was my turn. A week later, on a Friday, I stood in front of the bank where everything had begun. The glass doors reflected my face, not the stunned woman who once stood here, but someone who finally understood what Henry left behind. I walked in. I wasn't here to solve a mystery anymore. I wasn't here to dig into Henry's past. I was here to continue the work he started with kindness and a loyalty most people never manage in a lifetime. I made a small deposit for Sophie, not in Henry's place, but for the part of his life I now carry forward. When I stepped outside, a breeze moved through my hair. I looked up at the pale gray sky and spoke softly, as if Henry were somewhere nearby with that familiar quiet of his. Henry chose silence to protect others. and today I chose to speak, to protect what he left behind. Some secrets hurt when you finally learn them, but sometimes the truths you how someone loved you, even in the clumsiest way. What matters isn't what they hid, but how you choose to rise after knowing. That's where this story ends. Thank you for listening today. What do you think about Marianne's choice? What would you do in her place? If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below.